Wie schon angekündigt ist der Vortrag und auch die Moderation ab jetzt auf Englisch. Sie können aber im Anschluss gerne auch Fragen auf Deutsch stellen, die ich dann übersetzen werde, ganz einfach. Und Della Porta versteht auch einiges an Deutsch, mehr als sie zugibt. So then, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Stefan Maltana, again for English speakers. I'm a researcher here at the Hamburger Institute for Social Research. I have the great pleasure to introduce Donatella Della Porta. We are indeed very proud and happy to have her to introduce our series, our lecture series on violence in civil wars, which is part of the annual lectures and the Hamburg lectures on violence research, as we call them. So I will have to give a very brief introduction. We have then 1.5 hours, about an hour for the lecture and 30 minutes for discussion. Very briefly, Donatella Della Porta is professor of political science at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence, and professor of sociology at the European University Institute, also in Florence, and the director of the Center on Social Movement Study called Cosmos in these two institutions. So her work, as many of you will know, is centered on social movement studies, but also fields like democratization, civil society, corruption, and last but not least, violence research. She directed several large EU-funded research projects, among them Mobilization for Democracy and several others. She has authored and co-edited more than 60 books, among them some of the most influential books in the field. In 2011, she was awarded the Matei Dogan Prize for achievements and contribution to the field of political sociology, indeed. To the point, or on the topic of the lecture series, what makes her work so inspiring for many colleagues working in the field of political violence or violence research is the fact that she links and connects different fields of research in terms of empirical findings, but also in terms of theoretical perspectives. Her book, Social Movements, Political Violence and the State, published in 1995, and her more recent book, Clandestine Political Violence, were truly path-breaking in this respect. Those interested in this work will find a very nice summary of some of this work in the recently published volume Gewaltmassen, edited by Axel Paul and Benjamin Schwalb in the Hamburg edition, the Institute's very own. You can find a copy outside if you're interested. So in a current book project, and in her lecture today, she will further expand on this approach by looking at civil wars, and particularly the connection between social movements, the movement for democratization and civil war. So please join me in welcoming Donatella Della Porta. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Stefan. It is a pleasure to be here. And I hope to learn also from the discussion and from tomorrow's debate, because it is civil war is a new topic to me, and it is a topic which I've encountered in two of my projects, and this is why I decided to try to bridge a little bit the literature of social movements with the one on civil war. First, as Stefan mentioned, I worked on clandestine political violence of what is usually called terrorism, and looking at different forms of political violence, even with the help of Stefan, Lorenzo Bosi, and other young researchers working in the field. What we started to reflect upon is to which extent conceptions, theories which have been developed in order to understand some forms of political violence could be useful also to illuminate us in understanding other forms. So I'm not saying that terrorism and civil wars are the same things, but it is interesting to see to which extent some of the mechanisms, especially that we found out when working on these forms of political violence, could be adapted also to analyze the phenomenon of civil wars. So there was an theoretical type of interest. But there was also then an empirical type of interest, because when I started this project on democratization from below, on the interventions of social movements in processes of transition from authoritarians to democratic regimes, it was at the same times in which the Arab Spring happened. And I started to do research on some of the countries in which there had been social movements in 2011 and afterwards. And this looked like movements moving towards democracy. But some of these cases instead became cases in which civil wars developed. So a sort of paradox, or at least something to investigate, was how does it happen that movements that were not totally non-violent, but mainly non-violent, in some countries and not in others, ended up into triggering civil wars, and civil wars of the most brutal type. So we started to analyze, for instance, Syria, and Libya as cases of movements for democracy, and we ended up having to deal with processes that had changed very quickly under our analytic and empirical investigations. During that type of research, I'd also encountered civil wars, because one of the general ideas of that project was to try to compare what sometimes is considered as uncomparable, that is, processes of democratizations in different times and in different spaces. Once again, it's not because I thought that everything was the same, but because I thought that very often there are some biases related with the theoretical lenses that we use in some periods and in some areas of the world, and that it could be useful to try to change the lenses and to see to which extent some mechanisms, once again, are comparable. So my idea there had been to compare, and two books which came out from this project did compare 1989 processes of democratization in Eastern Europe and the processes, the wave of 2011. And while analyzing 1989, of course, there are some troubled cases of democratization. I was interested especially in comparing the role that social movements played in all these processes, distinguishing cases of so-called pacted transitions, or I call them participated pacts, stressing the fact that there were social movements also there, with cases of eventful democratizations, where social movement played a big role or a larger role. But also there were some cases which did not fit in either one of the two types, which were more troubled paths of democratizations. And of course, one of the main examples was former Yugoslavia's. And in some cases, there were countries in which conditions for democratization seemed to be quite welcoming, quite positive. Former Yugoslavia had already started liberalizations. There were, especially in some states in the confederations, civil society organizations, which were quite strong if compared with civil society organizations in other Central and Eastern European regions. So the questions there was why did some countries, or did in some countries, democratization processes ended up not only in a lack of democratizations or in de-democratization processes, but even in some cases in very brutal civil wars. And as I'm especially been working on social movements, the first type of literature, social science literature, looked at in order to try to understand this phenomenon was social movement studies, which I found could tell us something about the process of radicalizations, but also have their limits. And so when I looked at potential for bridging different theories, I didn't look with the idea that I could just export social movement studies into other areas, but the hope was that I could learn also from literature which developed in other areas and improve social movement studies capacity to understand protest in different forms. Social movement studies had limits in looking at political violence. Attention to violence had been episodic at best. Usually, social movement studies have been concerned with peaceful type of movements. They've also developed very different type of approaches when looking at different forms of social movements. So, for instance, radical right groups have been usually addressed through a so-called breakdown theory, in which what was looked at was the anomic situation in which radical right-wing violence developed, while left-wing violence was more addressed within so-called resource mobilizations type of approach, which stressed instead the capacity of organizations to act in a rational and strategic way. Another limit of social movement studies was also admitted from within the main scholars in the approach, and it was a sort of structuralism, in the sense there was an attempt to understand especially amount of protest as a sort of dependent variable, as the outcome of societal structures. But there was much less attention to the agency, to the capacity of the people to produce some type of effect. And especially there was quite a divisions between studies that looked at the individual level, trying to explain the reasons for political violence with the psychological characteristics of some individuals. Others that looked more at the meso level, at the level of the organizations, and others which looked at the structural conditions. And in general, the attempt at explanations of the repertoires of the forms of protest was addressed through a quite well-developed toolkits of concepts. So the idea was that violence, for instance, in the work of Charles Tilly, was addressed quite systematically. So violence developed when in period of social changes. They developed when during conflicts between those who wanted to access a political system and those who resist. They develop in moment in which political opportunities, there is the conditions at the political system, are somehow considered as favorable. There must be hope in order to be mobilizations. And instead, when political opportunities close down, it is more likely that violence emerges. And these are type of interpretations that we can see help us explaining the development of political violence. So in most of the cases in which either terrorism or civil war developed, they don't develop out of a peaceful situations, but usually they develop out of escalation processes that are longer or shorter, in which people mobilize and find repressions, find difficulties in entering the political system. And the form of repression is, in fact, quite significant in explaining the amount and forms of violence. But there needs to be also mobilizing structures. So another element that social movement studies have pointed at is the fact that you need organizational resources. And I think this is also something that is useful in order to analyze episodes of political violence, including civil wars, a focus on the organizations, I call them the violent entrepreneurs, that facilitate the development of violence, especially those who have resources, skills, material instruments of interventions in violent ways. But all this, and this is also something that one learns from social movement studies, all this is filtered through what social movement studies has called framing. It is not the situation as such which produce violent reactions, but it is especially the ways in which the situation is interpreted, the type of frame that the people use in order to understand what the state is doing. And violence is usually produced or justified through feelings of injustice, to so-called injustice framing, when repression is not only perceived as brutal, but also perceived as unjust. Civil wars type of explanations. The literature on civil wars developed a lot, bridging two types of approaches in the social sciences. One structural approach, looking especially for conditions for civil wars, have been looking at the level of socioeconomic, cultural, and political characteristics as the general macro structures that tend to prevail in countries in which civil wars developed. So the idea is, let's look for independent variables, for conditions that explain us civil wars. Second type of approach, which is very much developed, widespread in the field, is the combination between this attention to the structural conditions with attention to a rational choice type of approach, looking for explanations of the ways in which the various actors act, especially in their own type of rationalities. In this sense, literature on civil wars has shifted from an analysis of grievances, why, so there's the assumptions that people mobilize when they are discontent, and that we have to look for these origins of discontent in order to understand the development of civil wars, into an analysis of so-called greed. So which type of resources do people involved in civil wars aim at conquering? And then there have been models, quantitative type of analysis that produced many type of indicators of conditions for civil wars: poverty, rapid urbanizations, inequalities, divisions within the countries between different ethnic groups or religious groups. At the political level, the presence of authoritarian regimes that do not allow other forms of representations of interest, or also the interventions of foreign powers. So the fact that many civil wars are sort of wars combated through other type of means. But I think that also this type of approach within civil wars type of perspective have some limits. There is a lot of analysis done on large number of civil wars, but they are often basis on weak type of indicators. So problem that in the social sciences are defined as probably of validity and reliability of indicators. Some of the variables that are used in these models are very difficult to operationalize, to measure, and often proxies are used, for instance, GDP, which are often used in order to indicate very different type of characteristics of a political system, like capacity to repress, but also a degree of economic well-being, and so on. So I think that one of the limits of this research using quantitative indicators is that it tends to rely on measures which are not always so reliable. But there are also other elements, and I want to focus especially on these theoretical elements. So if, from the methodological point of view, this research has its own caveats, I think that what is especially to be corrected and what social movements can contribute to this literature is a more dynamic visions. I think quantitative studies have helped us in order to understand some aspects of civil wars and the development of violence. But they have always, in this type of approach, considered the need of explaining through a capacity to distinguish what variables, structural dimensions, which can come before, and then the civil wars as an effect. But I think that this type of approaches have the limit of not considering that civil wars are very dynamic and processual. That is, they tend to construct to a large extent the very conditions that then allow them to develop and to survive. This is a point which has been made by, for instance, by two very different scholars that have looked at civil wars. One is Stathis Kalivas, who has done a very impressive analysis of the civil war in Greece. And another one is Elizabeth Wood, who has analyzed civil wars in Central America. Kalivas has used the rational choice approach. Elizabeth Wood has been looking more at the capacity, identity type of approach, let's say. But both stressed an element. Violent is an emergent type of phenomenon. So Kalivas, for instance, wrote, almost every macro-historical account of civil war points to the importance of pre-existing popular allegiances for the war's outcome. Yet, almost every micro-historical account points to a host of endogenous mechanisms whereby allegiances and identities tend to result from the war or are radically transformed by it. So the idea in this type of interpretations, which I think is quite useful, is to see not just a moment in which civil wars emerges from structural conditions at the political, economic, and cultural level, but also to look at the ways in which civil wars produce this type of identities and so on. And this is, in fact, attention that Kalivas called for is an attention to try to understand the way in which the advent of a civil war transforms individual preferences, choices, behaviors, and identities. And similarly, Lisbeth Wood stressed the fact that values, norms, practices, beliefs, and collective identities of the insurgents are not fixed, but tend to evolve in response to the experiences of the conflicts. So rather than looking at structural conditions and then the civil war as an outcome, what these scholars suggest, and what I want to do also in my research, is to try to look at the processes. In social movement studies, there have been an attempt to develop sort of agenda of research which takes this type of processual type of approach, which says rather than looking for causes and effects, we have to look for all the processes that are developed during the social movements, political violence, and civil wars in particular. So I think that's what we can try to do in order to bridge the two literature is to develop an approach which I present as relational, constructivist, and dynamic. Relational, it means in each civil wars there are many actors involved, and in particular, what we see is that civil wars, differently from the type of clandestine political violence I studied in the past, are the product of both strengths and weaknesses of different actors. So they represent a moment of unbalance, a moment in which no equilibrium is found. And this is a moment characterized by constant attempt by different actors to intervene. All these actors are quite complex. So in this research, we are looking at the cases I mentioned, Syria, Libya, former Yugoslavia, and also the Ukrainian cases, trying to also break down the idea that states or insurgents are coherent actors. They are all very divided type of actors, and during the conflicts they tend to also become more and more divided inside. So it is not to one or the other actors, but I think to the relations that we have to look at. Second aspect is constructivist type of approach. It is not just external opportunities and constraints which are important in order to understand escalations in civil wars, but I think what is very important is to look at the framing in which the conflict is understood by the different actors. And looking at this framing, also one has to distinguish different actors, both the fighting groups, but also those who do not fight, but have a need to acquire what I will tell. I think is especially a need for security, which is produced by the civil wars itself, and then the different actors intervening, trying to address in different ways. So the way in which the conflict is constructed is important, and it is another element which changes in time. So looking at civil wars, one and at this type of shift from peaceful movements into the most brutal violence, one needs also, I think, to look at the ways in which framing are constructed and change in time. And then I think one needs to develop this sort of dynamic processual type of analysis, looking at the way micro, macro, and meso level tend to interact in the constructions of activist networks. And I shift a few slides, but I will go back to them during the discussions. In the previous slide that I covered immediately because it is too long to present, I tried to summarize some results of my research on clandestine political violence, which are the main mechanisms which explain forms that are usually called terrorism. What I did for this research was to try to adapt and in the process of adaptations also transforming, this is why I cut that other slide, the type of mechanisms which I think are relevant to investigate in order to understand the development of civil wars. And in the paper, which I don't know if was distributed, all internally, but will become a book in some years, I guess. The idea is to follow in these different cases, which some scholars would say are incomparable, but which I think are comparable, notwithstanding the difference in the culture, politics, economics, and so on of the conflicts, to look for similarities in some of the causal mechanisms, some of the dynamics which I presented. And from the literature on social movements and civil wars, but also from the first results of this analysis, I've singled out these main mechanisms, which could be distinguished but not very neatly, between mechanisms relevant at the onset of the civil wars, at the beginning of civil wars, and then internal dynamics of persistence. Then processes which could be also very fast in times, through which violence produces violence, frames of aggressions produce other frame of aggressions, and so there is a spirals of a sort of, endogenously produce resources for the civil wars itself. I'm going to use some citations to illustrate some of these mechanisms, not all of them, but some which I think are particularly relevant. First of all, literature on civil wars in the quantitative type of perspective, looking for models that single out independent and dependent variables, have often stressed the fact that civil wars developed when democracy are not established, when normal channels for addressing conflict, democratic channels for addressing conflict are not developed yet. But these citations I found telling because it points at the fact that there are particular moments of political destabilizations. What we found in our research on Syria, Libya, or former Yugoslavia, is that this type of civil wars developed in what neo-institutional type of approaches called critical junctures, in moment of crisis. My puzzle, which was why moment of liberalizations produce or can end up in civil wars, is addressed in this literature, which stress the fact that transitions to democracies are very long and unstable type of processes. That democracies, when established, produce channels of peaceful management of conflicts, but the process is long. And I think this is a limit in democratization studies, not to consider how much time it was needed in the so-called first process of democratizations in Europe, in the United States, to create democracies out of authoritarian regimes. When we look at the European history with the help of sociologists, historians, and so on, we know that in countries like not only Italy and Germany, but also France or the UK or the United States, it took a long time before democracy was established. In nowadays studies of democratizations, one expects transitions from one day to the next. And I think that instead what we have to take into account, we're looking at this shift from struggle for democracy into civil wars, is that in countries like Libya or Syria, the establishment of democracies, the call for democracies, produced destabilizations without being able to create new institutions. And I think that looking at the dynamic of these destabilizations is useful also to understand episodes of de-democratizations like the Egyptian one or Turkey nowadays. Another element which could be seen as at the origins of the civil wars, but we can see also that it is produced by the dynamics of political violence itself. So the fact that violence tends to produce violence. This is, again, a citation from Stathis Khalifa's book. And he linked very much his explanations of civil wars to the need for actors to develop a control of the territory. But this control of the territory is contested, and it tends to fragment states territorially. It builds up on fragmentations. Any story of Libya will tell, any scholars of Libya will tell, the power of Gaddafi was not so strong at the periphery. Cyrenaica was an area in which protest had developed and had taken also very violent forms. But what civil wars produced is also spaces which are not divided between the state and the insurgents, but on which there are contestation. And in this micro dynamics, micro analysis of civil wars, I think Khalifa's is very convincing in singling out the relevance for the civil wars, for the dynamics of the civil wars, of what happens in specific territories. What he says is usually in civil wars, there is no need for violence where the state is controlling. There is no need for violence or little need for violence when the insurgents are controlling a territory. But the episodes that produce escalations always happen in areas in which there is a contested type of control. In these intermediate areas, I think it's important to focus the attention in order to understand the dynamic of violence itself. A German scholar who has looked also at civil wars in a perspective which I found very useful is Schlichter from Bremen, who has talked and pointed also at something which I think is very relevant to take into account trying to understand civil wars. And it is the fact that violence needs legitimation. So civil wars are moments in which violence explodes, violence is widespread, but this doesn't mean that violence doesn't need to be legitimized. To the contrary. As many historians have pointed at in explaining the development of states out of violence in the historical creations of state institutions, also in civil wars there is a constant need of establishing this type of legitimations. And this means that, differently from the clandestine political violence I had studied in the past, civil wars itself means a fluidification of the borders, of the territorial borders within each state, with attempt to create various types of institutions. So Schlichter says the shadow of violence falls on each single organizational aspects of armed groups. Violence is power. Insurgents need to turn this power into more stable relations and ultimately into dominations. This means what is important is the capacity of insurgents and losing capacity of the states, not only to perform militarily, but also to perform normal type of activities in the territory. So civil wars means that usually everyday life needs to be rearranged. Institution for everyday life needs to be developed. And these institutions could be more or less related with the different actors that are in conflict with each other, or with actors that emerge from the moment of destabilization. So in Libya or in Syria, for instance, in the struggle for democracies, local civil committee had developed also for the management of everyday life. This was a process which happened also in Egypt in the moment of vacuums. But they happened also in the GDR in 1989. The state is breaking down and other institutions need to be developed. In some of these cases we analyzed, they were still performing this type of functions, institutions which had emerged from the peaceful movement for democratizations, like local civil committees, but through different paths and in different ways, this type of everyday life activities legitimating violence were also performed by the armed groups. And this produced more or less legitimacy. In many cases, it is the lack of capacity to develop this type of legitimacy, this type of institutions that make for the failure for the demise of civil wars. But there is always some level of capacity to control the territory, also in Peru that Stefan has studied. And here is another mechanism which I think is relevant to analyze. It is the ways in which actions, spiraling, creating spirals of brutalizations, very often comes even before then theorizations about violence. So in many of these cases, what we see are episodes of escalations on one side or on the others. Very often the episodes of struggles for democratizations in countries like Syria or Libya were followed by some attempt at negotiating peaceful agreements. But this attempt became less and less credible through episodes or after episodes of escalations. And the dynamics of these episodes of the escalations, I think, should be understood very often with attention to the micro level. Kalivas, for instance, looked at the importance of informations in civil wars. Informations is very important for all actors because even for repression, in order to be focused on the enemy, you need good informations. But as Kalivas noticed analyzing the situation in Greece, very often at the local level, and especially in areas in which control is contested, both type of actors have to rely on very unreliable sources of information. So when you look at the episodes of brutal killing, the massacres during civil wars, in some cases they were produced also by a mix of indications from above, but also losing of control by the organizations, by the state, but also by the insurgents on the other end. And, for instance, the use of fake informations following totally different type of rational or irrational logics, revenge against neighbors, and so on. And I think that's what emerges importantly from our research and supports also other research in the fields is that very often behaviors come before theorization. So that in many of these cases, fear, revenge, outrage, justification, self-assertions comes from the dynamic of the civil wars themselves. This is another citation from Basinger. He's an American scholar who has written a very interesting book on the breakdown of the Soviet Union, in which he looked at the ways in which nationalism, re-emerging in the different republic, brought about peaceful or violence forms of movements, often characterized also by riots and internal civil wars. And one of the elements that Basinger stresses is that very often these episodes of very intense episodes of very brutal violence came also there from microtype of interactions that were theorized only later on, but that produced escalations, that produced sort of spirals of escalations, also because they were theorized later on. One contribution which I found very useful from Basinger is that he distinguishes nationalism in quiet times from what he calls nationalism in thickened type. So in the normal times, he says, nationalism, exclusive type of framing of ethno-nationalism, belongings, and so on are there, but they are very often not activated into political violence. This is what many scholars of ethno-nationalism stress. There is the potential for violence, but very often in quiet time, nationalism remains a stable background of interactions that very often are collaborative, as they were in the former Yugoslavia. This type of conceptions of nationalism change suddenly in what Basinger called thickened times. I called it in another research intense time. So in moment in which the normal ways of interactions no longer hold, in moments in which relationships have been destabilized, and in which entrepreneurs of violence, entrepreneurs of civil wars, collective actors, and so on, could reframe national identities in more aggressive type of way. And so what Basinger suggested, and we are also finding in our cases, is that motivations very often emerged in actions, sometimes very quickly. The transformations from a peaceful movement for democratizations into a brutal civil wars in Syria lasted just for a few months, and in former Yugoslavia, the conflicts radicalized very quickly. This happened especially through a sort of motivations in actions of the different type of actors. This, I think, is a general aspects of political violence which needs to be discussed and on which there are different positions. In looking at terrorist and jihadi violence, there has been recently in France a debate between the main scholars of Islamism, Olivier Roy, Gilles Kepel, and others, which focused especially on these aspects. Is violence first of all theorized, or is violence coming first of all out of behaviors? Olivier Roy stressed the fact that there was an Islamization of radicalizations rather than a radicalization of Islam, pointing at the fact that radical behaviors were there first. In most of the cases, there was not a slow process of believing that violence was right and then performing violence, but rather the justifications came later on, came in the heat of the actions. Basinger makes the same point talking about the breakdown of the Soviet Union. Nationalism was visited in actions. And this implied also that the general interactions between individuals started to be more and more framed within sectarian type of identifications. So what Basinger said is thickened history provide the context for a fundamental transformations of identities, which in quieter times were once believed to be fixed and immutable. What he looks at is, for instance, in some of the former Soviet republic, why suddenly 5 or 10? Why suddenly there is a development of inter-ethnic conflict. And what he noticed is how in this moment of what he calls thickened histories, in this eventful moment, in this moment in which time intensified and the normal rules of the game no longer applied, some episodes can quickly escalate, and they brings about identifications with the specific ethnic groups. So it is transformed in time. And I think that all of these elements are elements which we had not noted working on clandestine political violence, because they are related with this territorial control on the one hand, so the need for insurgents to develop institutions and legitimations of a control on different parts of the territories. But it is also the results of a process which could be considered as parallel to the process that developed with organized crime. That is, with organized crimes, it is usually said what the mafia sells is protection. And the mafia, at the same time, is at the origins of the need of protections. So the mafia as organized crimes tend to provide a sort of resource whose need is related to its very existence. The mafia creates violence, and then it sells the possibility to be protected. I think that a parallel process developed in civil wars. Civil wars create uncertainties. Civil wars, it is said, develop in conditions of economic strains. This is in part true, but economic strains could be at the same levels and are often at the same levels in countries in which there is no development of civil wars. What I think is more interesting to look at is the way in which civil wars transforms the political economy of a country, creating the need, for instance, of security, also in terms of material security. There have been research by economists on the effects of civil wars in terms of creating poverty, scarcity of resources, and so on. This means unemployment, growing poverty. This means people need to look for protection, for security, and they very often then need to rely upon those very actors that have produced, first of all, the conditions of insecurities. So what I think we look at when we look at the process of development of civil wars, it is continuous mechanisms of self-fulfilling prophecies on the one hand, brutality which calls for brutality and then received brutality, and at the same time also processes of related with the need to always bet on potential solutions for individual and collective survivals. So civil wars are situations in which, as I mentioned, normal rules of the game no longer applied, and many different actors are pushed towards looking for new wave of survival. And it is, I think, in this unbalance, which is constantly changing, which we can look for understanding for this type of processes. I think I will stop here, and looking forward to the debate. Thank you.
Thanks so much.